So the question is, what is DDMS? And basically, it's just an Android tool that provides a whole bunch of different debugging features. And basically, its layout is broken out into three primary sections. The first section lists all of your connected devices and AVDs, or your emulators, or your virtual devices or your emulators. And if you look at it, you can see that it shows each one individually. So if we look here, we can see that there's the emulator connected up, and we can see there's a device connected up. Notice that the names as they appear are very consistent with the way the ADB tool returned the names, because it's using those names, or what we call the serial numbers. There's another section here for the individual tools within DDMS, and we'll talk about each one of these tabs inside of there. But we've got this tools area, and there's the logcat view. Right, so just like when we were in the Java perspective, when we're in the DDMS perspective, we can still see the logcat information. Now, when we look at the device tab, and you see that each of the devices there, the emulator and the device, you'll notice that there's a different number of processes showing in each one of those. And what it comes down to is that for a process to be visible in DDMS, it must be debugging, or debugging must be enabled. So you notice that when we look at the device information, you notice there's only two processes showing in this case. Right? That's because most devices ship with a standard build of Android. In other words, it's not a debug build, it's an actual production build of Android. Well, whenever you're looking at a device that has a non-debug build of Android, the only processes that you can see are processes that are specifically built to be debuggable. Right? So in this case, my device is connected up. I happen to have two applications on here that are built to actually have debugging enabled. Now, on the other hand, if you're connecting to an emulator or a device that has a debug build of the Android operating system, in that case, you can see all processes running on it. Right? So the emulators pretty much always have a debug build running. It is, of course, possible to put a debug build of Android onto a standard device. If you work for a company that actually sells Android devices, of course that's true. You can download versions off the internet that are that way. But when you buy an Android device at a store, generally it's not going to be a debug build. But the key thing is that something has to be debuggable. If the OS is debuggable, every process is visible. If the OS is not debuggable, then only those processes that are explicitly debuggable are visible. Now, to understand what DDMS is capable of, it's important to look at our tools architecture again. Right? So what I have on screen right now is the map of kind of all the things we talked about introducing the tools. What we want to focus on now is the DDMS aspect of this. Right? So if we kind of boil this down and we're looking at DDMS, in order to really understand what DDMS is capable of, we need to understand a bit about the way our apps run when we're dealing with Android or we're working with Android. Now, just like with .NET, right, Java runs a virtual machine. So when we think about our apps running, we need to realize that there's a virtual machine and our app is running inside of that. Right? So each process gets its own copy of what we call the Dalvik virtual machine, or the Android virtual machine. So if I start up another application, it has its own virtual machine instance that it's running inside of. And ADB connects to each one of those individually. And so that tells us that, well, if DDMS is connected into this ADB pipeline, and the ADB pipeline is connecting up into each one of these virtual machines, and our apps are inside there, well, we have a lot of access to information. So as we think about what DDMS itself is capable of, well, it can do a lot of things. Right? Is that if we look at each app out there, DDMS can reach inside that virtual machine and see everything that's going on inside the virtual machine for that app. And it can do that for every app that's running on our device or our emulator. And in fact, remember that the ADB environment actually connects into the Android OS itself. So DDMS is able to reach inside of there and work very closely with the operating system. And in fact, the whole environment even connects up very closely with our virtual devices, with our emulators, so that it's capable of even taking very close control and managing the behavior of the emulators themselves. With all that in mind, we can now look at the individual tools that are available to us within DDMS. The first tools we'll look at are the process-oriented tools, right? The tools that tell us what's going on inside of an individual process or effectively an app. So there are tools that let us see the memory usage, right? The kind of memory consumption our app is experiencing. There are tools that will let us see the individual thread activity, including the call stacks for each thread. There are tools that allow us to see the network activity for each individual app, right? In mobile devices, that's obviously very important because we rely on our communications a great deal. We'll then look at the tools that allow us to interact with the device and virtual device environments. One of the ones that's really helpful is the ability to access the file system. We can do screen captures to see what a given screen looks like or save that for later. And we can even closely control an emulator's environment. So we can actually simulate things going on for that emulator to test our apps more effectively through the emulators. Now, as I mentioned, DDMS is really a central tool for debugging our Android apps. So we're going to look, the ones we're going to look at that I've mentioned are the core ones we use, but DDMS goes much further than that. There's a lot of other features inside there. So I give you that URL and I encourage you to go check that out when you have a chance. It walks through all the individual tools that are built into DDMS.